Out here, a man doesn't die when his heart stops, he dies when no one decides to keep him alive. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from, and if you believe in justice that rides silent, stay with me, because this one doesn't end the way you think. The desert stretched endless and pale under a hard noon sun, heat rising in waves that blurred the horizon, and somewhere between two dying ridgelines, a man lay face down in the dust, unmoving, his coat stiff with salt and sweat, his hat lost to the wind hours ago, maybe days, and the only sound left around him was the slow whisper of sand shifting with every breath he could barely take. Ethan Cole had stopped counting time when the canteen ran dry, stopped thinking when the sun pressed too heavy against his skull, and now even the idea of standing felt like something that belonged to another man entirely. Then a shadow crossed his back, narrow at first, then still, as if the sun itself had been cut in half, and though his eyes refused to open, something in him knew. This was not the desert anymore. Ayanna Red Hawk stood over him without a word, her boots planted firm in the dust, the wind tugging lightly at the edge of her leather dress, her dark eyes steady as they traced the outline of a stranger who did not belong on her land, a white man, alone, unarmed, and closer to death than to any kind of explanation. She didn't kneel right away, didn't reach for the water at her side, because out here, every choice carried weight, and every life had to be measured against what it might cost. She circled once. Slow, deliberate, noting the cracked lips, the shallow rise of his chest, the faint tremor in his fingers, then she stopped again at his side, just close enough to hear the quiet struggle of breath that refused to give up. A lesser soul might call it mercy, what she did next, but there was no softness in the way she moved, no hesitation left in her hands as she lowered herself to one knee and tipped a single drop of water onto his lips. Watching, not helping, not yet, just watching to see if the man beneath her was still worth the trouble of saving. Ethan stirred, barely, a twitch more. Then a movement, but it was enough for her to know that whatever he had been before the desert found him, he wasn't finished yet. She gave him another drop, then another, never more than he could take, never enough to waste, and when his eyes finally cracked open against the burning light, the first thing he saw wasn't the sky, it was her, still as stone, looking down at him like a question he hadn't earned the right to answer. He tried to speak, but the sound broke apart before it reached the air, and she didn't ask his name, didn't offer hers, because names didn't matter out here, not until a man proved he could carry them. Instead, she rose slowly, stepping back just enough to let the sun fall across his face again, and for a long moment, neither of them moved, the silence between them stretching wider than the desert itself, until somewhere far off, beyond the heat and the dust, a faint rhythm began to echo. Hoofbeats, distant but certain, rolling across the open land. Like something that had already decided where it was going, Ayanna's eyes shifted, just slightly, not toward him, but toward the horizon, and whatever she saw there, whatever shape was forming beyond the shimmer of heat, it changed the weight of the moment in a way Ethan couldn't yet understand, because the desert had not finished with him, and neither had the past he thought he'd left buried beneath it. The hoofbeats carried closer, steady and unhurried, like men who already knew what they would find when they arrived, and Ayanna did not turn her head again because she had already seen enough in the distance to understand that whatever was coming was not lost, not wandering, but searching. Ethan tried to push himself up, his arms trembling beneath him, but the strength would not come, and the effort only drew a dry breath from his chest that sounded too loud in the still air. "Do not," she said, her voice low, calm, not a command but something heavier, something final, and he froze, not because he trusted her, but because he did not have the strength to argue. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of leather and horse, and now he heard it clearly, for riders, maybe 5. Spaced apart just enough to cover ground without crowding each other, the kind of formation men used when they expected trouble but did not fear it. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, and in that darkness, memory came back sharp and unwelcome, the outline of faces, the weight of choices made when the sun was not this high and the land was not this quiet, and when he opened them again, there was no confusion left, only recognition. "They are not yours," Ayanna said without looking at him, and it took him a second to understand she was not asking. He swallowed, his throat still raw, and forced the words out slow and clear enough for her to hear. "No, they are not," and that was all she needed to know. She stepped away from him then, just 3 paces forward, placing herself between him and the rising line on the horizon. her posture relaxed but grounded, as if the earth itself held her steady. Ethan watched her, confusion cutting through the exhaustion, because she did not reach for a weapon, did not call for help, did not even glance back to see if he could stand. She simply stood there, facing what was coming with a stillness that felt heavier than any threat. The riders came into view soon after, shapes first, then figures, hats low against the sun, coats moving with the rhythm of their horses, and when they slowed at the edge of sight, Ethan felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with the heat. They saw him, he knew they did, saw the man they had been tracking across miles of open land, and for a moment, the distance between them held, stretched thin by silence. Then one of them nudged his horse forward a few steps, not enough to close the gap, just enough to make a point, and Ethan's hand twitched in the dust, an old instinct rising before reason could catch it. Ayanna noticed, not by looking, but by feeling the shift behind her, and she spoke again, softer this time, "Stay." And the word settled over him like shade. The lead rider stopped his horse, studying her now, not Ethan, and there was a pause, long enough for the wind to move between them, long enough for something unspoken to pass from one side to the other. No one reached for anything, no voice broke the quiet, and yet the air felt full, heavy with decision. Ethan did not understand it, could not see what held them back, but he saw it happen, the smallest change in the man's posture, the slight turn of his head, and then, without a word, the horse shifted, angled away, and the others followed, one by one, until the line broke and the riders turned back the way they had come. The sound of hoofbeats faded as slowly as it had arrived, leaving nothing behind but dust and the echo of something that should not have happened. Ethan stared at Ayanna, still standing where she had placed herself, and for the first time since he opened his eyes in the desert, he realized the truth was not that she had saved him from the sun, or the thirst, or even the men who had come for him. The truth was that she had decided, without asking his name, without hearing his story, that he was a man who would not die that day, and out here, that was the only reason that mattered. The desert did not speak after the riders left, but something in the silence had changed, as if the land itself had taken note of a choice that could not be undone. Ayanna remained where she stood for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the empty horizon, not to make sure they were gone, but to measure the absence they left behind, and only when the last trace of dust settled into the earth did she turn back toward Ethan Cole, who still lay where he had fallen, breathing, watching, trying to understand a world that had just spared him without reason. She walked back without hurry, each step quiet against the sand, and when she reached him, she did not ask what he had done or why those men had turned away, because answers had a way of making things heavier than they needed to be. Instead, she knelt again, this time closer, and placed the canteen beside him, not in his hand, but within reach, an offering with no instruction attached. Ethan stared at it for a second, then at her, his voice rough when it finally came. "You should have let them take me," and the words hung there, dry as the air between them. Ayanna tilted her head slightly, studying him as if he had said something unfamiliar, not wrong, just incomplete, and after a pause that stretched just long enough to matter, she replied, "They did not come for me," her tone steady, unburdened by doubt. Ethan let out a breath that almost became a laugh but did not quite make it, because there was no humor left in him, only the slow realization that whatever had just happened had not been about him at all. He pushed himself up again, this time managing to sit, the effort costing him more than he showed, and reached for the canteen, taking a careful sip the way a man learns after losing too much too fast. The water tasted like life, and that alone made him pause, because nothing out here was given without reason. "Why?" he asked then, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the line where sky met earth. "Why help me?" And this time, Ayanna did not answer right away. She shifted her weight, settling back onto her heels, her hands resting loosely in her lap, and for the first time since she found him, there was something in her expression that was not just observation, something quieter, harder to name. "Because you were still breathing," she said at last, and though the words were simple, they carried a weight that settled deeper than any explanation could. Ethan shook his head slightly, the movement slow, disbelieving, because in his world, breath alone had never been enough to earn anything. He had seen men walk past others for less, had done it himself once or twice, back when the lines were clearer and the choices easier to justify. "That is not a reason," he said, and now there was something in his voice, not anger, not quite regret, but something close. Ayana looked at him then, directly, her dark eyes steady in a way that made it hard to look away, and for a moment, the wind picked up just enough to move a strand of her hair across her cheek before settling again. It is the only one that matters, she replied, and there was no force in her tone, no need to convince, only a quiet certainty that did not ask for agreement. Ethan held her gaze longer this time, searching for something behind the words. Some hidden meaning that would make sense of the way those riders had turned, the way she had stood, the way his life had been weighed and somehow returned to him, but there was nothing there except truth, simple and unmoving. He looked away first, down at his hands, still unsteady, still marked by the dust of miles he had not meant to travel, and in that moment, something shifted inside him, small, almost unnoticeable, but real. Ayana rose then, brushing the sand from her knees, and turned slightly toward the distant hills, as if already thinking of the path ahead. "You can walk?" she asked, not with concern, but with expectation, and Ethan glanced up at her, surprised by the question, because it assumed something he was not sure he still had. He tested his legs slowly, pushing himself higher, the ground unsteady beneath him, the world tilting for a second before settling back into place. And though the strength was not fully there, it was enough. "I can try," he said, and that seemed to be all she needed. She gave a small nod, not approval, not encouragement, just acknowledgement, and began to walk, not waiting to see if he would follow. Ethan watched her take a few steps ahead, the distance between them already forming, and for a second, he considered staying where he was, letting the desert finish what it had started, because that would have been easier, simpler, familiar. But then he looked at the canteen in his hand, at the faint imprint of her choice still lingering in the air, and slowly, unsteadily, he pushed himself forward to follow, not because he understood, but because for the first time in a long while, something ahead of him felt worth the effort of reaching. The desert does not forgive weakness, and it does not wait for a man to decide who he wants to be before it tests him again, and by the time Ethan took his 10th step behind Ayana, his breath had already begun to betray him, each inhale shallow, each exhale heavier than the last, but she did not slow, did not look back, because out here, the only kindness that mattered was the kind that did not turn into dependence. The ground shifted under his boots, fine sand giving way to patches of hard-packed earth, and the sun climbed higher, pressing down like a hand that refused to lift, and still she walked, her pace steady, measured, as if she had already decided how far he could go before he failed. Ethan stumbled once, caught himself, and kept moving, not because he had strength left, but because stopping now felt like admitting something he was not ready to face. After what felt like miles but could not have been more than half of one, Ayana finally slowed, not for him, but for the land, her eyes scanning the terrain ahead, a narrow cut between two low ridges where shadows held longer than the open ground, and without a word, she angled toward it. Ethan followed, the shift in direction pulling him forward with what little focus he had left, and when they stepped into the shade, the temperature dropped just enough to make the air feel different, thinner somehow, easier to carry in his lungs. She stopped there, finally, turning to face him fully for the first time since they began moving, and in that stillness, the distance between them felt smaller, not in space, but in something harder to name. "Sit," she said, and this time it was not a suggestion. Ethan did not argue, lowering himself onto a flat rock with a slow, careful motion, his legs grateful in a way he would not admit out loud, and he watched as she moved a few feet away, crouching near a patch of dry brush, her hands working quietly, efficiently, gathering something he could not quite see. The wind shifted again, softer now, carrying the faint scent of something earthy, and when she returned, she held a small bundle of leaves and roots, worn but purposeful, and without explanation, she set them beside him and reached for his arm. Ethan stiffened at the contact, not out of fear, but out of habit, a reflex built from years of not letting anyone get close enough to matter, but her grip was firm, not forceful, and he found himself letting it happen. She examined his forearm, the skin dry, marked by the desert, and nodded once to herself before pressing one of the crushed leaves gently against a cracked patch, the coolness of it surprising him enough to draw a quiet breath. "This will help," she said, not looking at him, her focus on the work, and he watched her for a moment, trying to understand the balance she carried so easily, the way she could decide a man was worth saving and still treat him like he had something to prove. "You knew they would leave," he said after a while, the question buried inside the statement. and her hands paused just long enough to acknowledge it before continuing. "I knew they would not stay," she replied, and the difference between the two settled in the air like dust. Ethan frowned slightly, turning the words over in his mind, because they did not answer what he was really asking, and she seemed to know that. She finished with his arm, then sat back on her heels again, meeting his gaze with that same steady calm. "Men like that follow what they understand," she said, "and they did not understand me, and there was no pride in it, no challenge. Just a simple truth spoken like something learned a long time ago." Ethan looked away, his eyes drifting to the edge of the shade where sunlight still burned against the sand, and for the first time, he began to see the shape of it, not fully, not clearly, but enough to feel the weight of it settle into his chest. It was not that she had stopped them, not in the way he knew stopping, it was that she had stood in a place they could not cross without becoming something they were not ready to be. He let out a slow breath, the kind that carried more thought than air, and shook his head slightly. "Where I come from," he said, "men do not turn away like that," and Ayana's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened just a fraction. "Then you have been walking in the wrong place," she said, and rose to her feet again, the moment already moving past her. Ethan sat there for a second longer, the words settling deeper than he expected, and then he pushed himself up once more, slower this time, more aware of the ground beneath him, and when he looked at her again, standing at the edge of the shade, waiting without waiting, he understood something he had not before, that the desert had not just taken from him, it had brought him to a place where the rules were different, and whether he understood them or not, he was already part of them now. The shade did not last long, and Ayana did not pretend that it would, because in this land, comfort was something you borrowed, never something you owned, and when she stepped back into the sun, she did not check if Ethan followed, because she had already learned enough about him to know that if he stayed, it would not be because he could not move, but because he chose not to. Ethan rose slower this time, the ache in his body settling into something steadier, less sharp, and as he stepped forward, he noticed the way his feet found the ground more carefully now, as if each step carried a weight he had not felt before. They moved along the ridge, the path narrowing just enough to guide them without needing words, and the desert stretched wide on both sides, empty in a way that no longer felt silent, but watchful. After a while, Ethan spoke again, not because he needed to, but because the quiet between them had started to feel like something he did not fully understand. "You walk like you know where this ends," he said, his voice stronger now, though still rough at the edges, and Ayana did not slow, her gaze fixed ahead. "It does not end," she replied, and the simplicity of it made him pause for a second before continuing, because it was not the answer he expected, but it felt like the only honest one he had heard in a long time. The ground shifted again beneath them, the sand giving way to scattered stone, and the air carried a faint change, cooler by a fraction. Enough for Ayana to notice before Ethan did, and she angled slightly to the left, toward a low cluster of rock that broke the flat line of the land. When they reached it, she stopped, placing her hand against the stone for a moment, not as support, but as if feeling something through it, and then she moved around the side, disappearing from Ethan's view for a second. He followed, slower, and when he rounded the edge, he saw it. A narrow opening between the rocks, shadowed and still, and at its base, a shallow pool no wider than a wagon wheel, the surface barely moving, but unmistakably water. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his breath catching, not from effort this time, but from something closer to disbelief, because out here, water was not just survival, it was something rarer, something earned, and he looked at her, searching for the explanation she had not given. Ayana knelt beside the pool, dipping her fingers into it first, testing, then cupping her hand and bringing the water to her lips, slow, deliberate, and only after she had taken a small drink did she gesture toward it, a quiet permission. Ethan stepped forward, dropping to one knee with less hesitation than before, and this time, when he drank, he did not rush, he did not take more than he needed, and somewhere in that restraint, something shifted again, small but real. When he finished, he sat back, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, and let out a breath that felt deeper than any he had taken since the desert found him. "You knew this was here," he said. And she nodded once. "I have walked this path before," she replied, and there was no pride in it, only memory. Ethan looked at the water again, then back at her. "You bring strangers here often?" he asked, and this time, there was a faint change in her expression, not quite a smile, not quite anything he could name, but enough to make the air between them feel different. "No," she said simply. And that single word carried more weight than any explanation could. Ethan held her gaze for a moment. Then looked away, understanding settling in without needing to be spoken, because this place, this water, was not something shared lightly, not something given without reason. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying a hint of something distant, and Ayana's head turned slightly, her attention shifting beyond the rocks, beyond the ridge, to something Ethan could not yet see or hear, and though she did not speak, the stillness in her posture changed, sharpened, and Ethan felt it, the quiet signal that whatever path they had stepped onto was not done unfolding, and whatever waited ahead would not ask who he had been before it decided who he would need to become. The shift in the air came. Before the sound, subtle but certain, like the desert drawing a breath it had been holding too long, and Ayana rose from the edge of the water without urgency, yet without delay, her eyes fixed on a distant line where the light bent just slightly wrong. Ethan noticed it now too, not with the same clarity, but enough to feel the change settle into his bones, that quiet warning that something ahead had already begun moving toward them. "More riders?" he asked, his voice lower, steadier than before, and she shook her head once, slow, deliberate. "No," she said, and the single word carried a weight that made him wish she had said yes instead. She stepped away from the pool, brushing her hands lightly against her sides, then looked back at him, not measuring him this time, but considering something else entirely, something that did not belong to the moment they were in, but to what might follow. "We do not stay," she said. And there was no room in it for question, only direction. Ethan nodded, rising carefully, his body responding quicker now, not fully strong, but no longer failing him with every movement, and he took one last look at the water before turning away, understanding without being told that places like this were not meant to be lingered in. They moved again, this time not along the ridge, but down into a shallow draw where the ground dipped and twisted, offering less visibility but more cover, and the sun followed them, slipping between the rock and shadow in uneven patterns that made distance harder to judge. After a few minutes, the sound came, faint at first, not hoofbeats, not voices, but something lighter, carried on the wind in broken pieces, like wood tapping against wood, or something loose shifting where it should have been still. Ethan slowed slightly, listening, his instincts catching up with his thoughts. "What is that?" he asked, and Ayana did not answer right away, her head turning just enough to follow the direction of the sound. Her eyes narrowing not in fear, but in focus. They rounded a bend in the draw, and the source revealed itself in fragments, first a wagon wheel leaning at an angle it should not hold, then a length of canvas caught on a splintered frame, moving gently in the wind, and finally the full shape of it, a supply wagon, abandoned, half-tilted, resting against the side of the draw as if it had simply stopped and never found a reason to move again. Ethan stopped, something in his chest tightening in a way that had nothing to do with the desert, because he knew wagons like this, knew what they carried, knew the kind of journeys that ended this way. Not with noise, not with struggle, but with absence. Ayana approached first, her steps quiet, measured, circling the wagon once before drawing closer, her eyes scanning every detail, the tracks around it, the condition of the wood, the way the canvas had torn. Ethan followed slower, his gaze moving over the crates still tied down, the scattered supplies that had not been taken, and that was what struck him most, not what was gone, but what remained. "No one claimed it," he said, more to himself than to her, and she nodded once, her hand brushing lightly against the side of the wagon, feeling the dryness of the wood, the stillness of something left too long. She moved to the front, where the hitch rope hung loose, the space beyond it empty, and crouched there, studying the ground for a moment before speaking. "They left in a hurry," she said, and Ethan frowned slightly, because nothing about the scene felt hurried, everything felt paused. He stepped closer, looking again, and then he saw it. Not a clear mark, not something obvious, but enough, the uneven pattern in the dust, the faint drag where something had shifted direction more than once, and suddenly, the stillness did not feel empty anymore, it felt interrupted. "Where did they go?" he asked, and Ayana stood slowly, her gaze lifting from the ground to the open land beyond the draw, and for the first time since he had met her, there was something in her expression that hinted at uncertainty, not fear, but the recognition of something that did not follow the path it should have, not where they meant to. She said quietly, and the wind picked up just enough to move the torn canvas again, the soft tapping returning, steady now, like a reminder that whatever story this wagon held, it had not ended here, and whatever had pulled those people away from it, had not finished moving through the desert. The wagon did not belong to silence, not anymore, and the longer Ethan stood there, the more he felt it, the sense that something had passed through this place and left it holding its breath. Ayanna moved first, stepping beyond the wagon without hesitation, her eyes following a line in the dust that did not quite look like a trail but carried intention all the same, and when she crossed the edge of the draw, she did not look back, because whatever had pulled those people away had left something behind that needed to be understood before it could be followed. Ethan lingered a moment longer, his hand brushing lightly against the worn wood of the wagon, feeling the dryness, the stillness, and something else beneath it, something unsettled, like a story that had been cut short before it found its ending. He turned then and followed her, his steps quicker now, not from strength, but from the pull of something he could not name. The ground beyond the draw stretched wider, flatter, but not empty, not anymore, because now there were signs, faint, scattered, but there, a footprint that did not hold shape, a shift in the sand where something had paused, turned, changed direction without reason. They were not running, Ethan said quietly, more certain of that than anything else he had seen so far, and Ayanna nodded once, her gaze still moving across the land. No, she said, they were looking, and the difference between those two truths settled heavily between them. They walked the line together now, not side by side, but close enough that the distance no longer felt like separation, and as they moved, the pattern began to reveal itself, not clearly, not fully, but enough to suggest that whatever had drawn those people away had not been behind them, but ahead. After a while, the land shifted again, the flat ground rising gently into a low ridge, and Ayanna slowed as they reached it, her posture tightening just slightly, not in fear, but in recognition of something she had not expected to find. Ethan felt it too, the subtle change, the way the air seemed to hold a different kind of stillness, one that did not belong to emptiness, but to presence. They crested the ridge together, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because what lay below did not fit the pattern of anything they had followed so far. There was no camp, no clear path, no sign of settlement, only a scattered line of objects stretching across the sand, small at first, then clearer as they stepped down, pieces of cloth, a dropped canteen, a child's shoe half buried in the dust, each one placed not by carelessness, but by something that had broken the order of movement into fragments. Ethan slowed, his eyes moving from one piece to the next, and with each step, the weight of it grew, not in fear, but in understanding that this was not abandonment, not in the way he had seen before. This was interruption, something that had taken hold of a moment and pulled it apart without leaving a clear trace of how. They did not leave together, he said, the words quiet but certain, and Ayanna stopped a few feet ahead, turning slightly as if measuring the space between each object, the distance between each step that had been taken here. No, she replied, and this time, there was something else in her voice, not uncertainty, but the recognition of a pattern she had not wanted to see. The wind moved again, lifting a piece of cloth just enough to reveal the ground beneath it, and for a brief second, Ethan thought he saw something there, not a mark, not a track, but an absence, a place where the sand had settled differently, as if something had passed through it without leaving weight behind. He blinked, and it was gone, just sand again, just desert, but the feeling did not leave him. What does that mean? He asked, and Ayanna did not answer right away, her eyes still fixed on the ground, on the space between things rather than the things themselves, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before, not from fear, but from the care of naming something that should not be named too quickly. It means, she said slowly, they were not alone, and the words settled into the air with a weight that did not need explanation, because whatever had moved through this place had not followed the rules Ethan understood, and whatever it was, it had not finished moving yet. The wind moved differently now, not across the land, but through it, slipping between the scattered objects as if it remembered where everything once belonged, and Ethan found himself stepping slower, not because the ground was uneven, but because something in the air told him that rushing here would mean missing what mattered. Ayanna crouched near the small shoe half buried in the sand, her fingers brushing lightly across its surface, not to clean it, not to claim it, but to feel the story it still held. And when she lifted her hand, she did not look at the shoe again, because what she needed was already understood. A child walked here, Ethan said, his voice low, almost careful, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something unseen, and Ayana nodded once, but her eyes remained on the ground beyond it, tracing a line that did not exist to anyone else, and then stopped. She added, and the space between those two truths carried more weight than either one alone. Ethan looked ahead, following where her gaze led, and for a moment, he saw nothing, just sand, just distance, just the same empty stretch he had been crossing since before he met her. But then, slowly, his eyes adjusted, and he noticed it, the subtle break in the surface, not a footprint, not a track, but a place where the sand had settled too smooth, too untouched, as if something had passed without pressing down. That is not possible, he said quietly, and Ayana rose to her feet, her posture still grounded, as if the impossibility of it did not change what it was. It is not meant to be, she replied, and there was no mystery in her voice, only recognition. They moved forward together, step by step, following not a trail, but a pattern of absence, each piece of the wagon story leading them further into something that refused to be explained by the rules Ethan had lived by. After a short distance, the scattered items began to thin, the signs of interruption fading into the open desert again, but the feeling did not fade with them. It grew, quieter, deeper, like something waiting just beyond sight. Ethan stopped suddenly, his breath catching not from effort, but from a sensation he could not name, like the air had shifted just enough to press against him instead of around him. Do you feel that? He asked, and this time, Ayana did not answer right away, because she had already felt it long before he spoke. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning not the ground, but the space between the ground and the sky, as if searching for something that did not belong to either. Yes, she said finally, and her voice was softer now, not uncertain, but aware of the weight of what stood between them and whatever came next. Ethan took a step back without meaning to, his instincts pulling against something his mind could not yet see, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, dense, as if the desert itself had drawn closer. Then, without warning, the wind stilled completely, not faded, not weakened, but stopped, as if something had placed a hand over the land and told it to be quiet. Ayana's gaze fixed on a point just ahead of them, no more than 10 feet away, and though Ethan saw nothing at first, he felt it, the way the air bent, the way the light shifted just slightly, enough to make the space feel wrong, not broken, but altered. Do not move, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying more weight than any command he had ever heard, and Ethan froze, every part of him suddenly aware of the ground beneath his boots, the air against his skin, the space around him that no longer felt empty. For a long moment, nothing happened, and then, just at the edge of sight, something changed, not appearing, not forming, but revealing itself by what it displaced, a shimmer in the air, a distortion that moved without sound, without direction, and Ethan's breath caught as he realized the truth that settled into him all at once, that whatever had taken those people from the wagon had not left tracks because it did not need to touch the ground, and now, standing in front of him, it was no longer just a story told by scattered objects in the sand, it was something present, something watching, and something that had not yet decided whether he and Ayana were meant to walk away from it at all. The air did not move, and in that stillness, time itself seemed to hesitate, stretching thin between one breath and the next, and Ethan Cole realized something he had never learned on any trail or in any town, that silence could be louder than sound when it carried intention. The shimmer ahead shifted again, not forward, not back, but sideways, like heat bending over iron, except there was no heat there, no fire, only a distortion that held its place as if it belonged. Ayana did not step back, did not raise her hands, did not reach for anything at her side. She simply stood, her posture steady, her eyes fixed on the space where the world refused to look the same twice. It sees us, Ethan said under his breath, the words barely leaving him, but they felt too large to keep inside, and Ayana answered without turning, it has always seen, her voice calm, as if this was not the first time she had stood in front of something that did not need eyes to know where a person stood. The shimmer pulsed once, faint, like a ripple across glass, and the light around it dimmed just slightly, not enough to notice unless you were already looking, and Ethan's hand twitched again, an old reflex reaching for something that was not there, something that would make sense of what he was facing. What do we do? He asked, and for the first time since he had met her, there was a pause in Ayana's stillness, not hesitation, but a moment of choosing. She stepped forward then, just one pace. Placing herself a little closer to the distortion, and Ethan felt the shift in the air as if it had weight now, pressing lightly against his chest. "We do not run," she said, and the certainty in her voice did not leave room for the thought that had already begun forming in his mind. The shimmer moved again, this time not as a ripple, but as a slow, deliberate turn, and though there was no face, no shape he could name, Ethan felt it. The unmistakable sensation of being regarded, measured in a way that did not belong to any man he had ever known. Ayana lifted her hand slowly, not toward it, but to her own chest, resting it there for a brief second, and when she spoke again, her words were softer, not directed at Ethan, not even spoken for him to understand, but offered into the space between them and the unseen presence. The language was not his, but the tone carried something clear, something grounded, not fear, not challenge, but acknowledgement, as if she were speaking to something that did not require explanation, only respect. The air held that moment, stretched it, and for a second that felt longer than it should. Nothing changed, the shimmer remained, the light stayed bent, and Ethan wondered if this was where the story of the wagon had ended, not with noise or struggle, but with a moment like this, where the world paused and waited for something unseen to decide. Then, slowly, the pressure in the air shifted, not lifting, but easing, like a hand loosening its grip, and the distortion flickered once more, less sharply this time, its edges softening as if the desert itself had begun to reclaim it. Ayana lowered her hand, her eyes never leaving that space, and took one step back, not retreating, but allowing distance to return where it had been taken. Ethan felt his breath come back into him all at once, deeper than before, as if he had been holding it without realizing, and he did not move, not yet, because something in him understood that this was not over, not fully. The shimmer thinned, fading not into nothing, but into something that could no longer be seen, only felt, and the wind returned in a single quiet sweep across the sand, carrying with it the faintest trace of movement that had no direction. Ayana turned then, finally, her gaze shifting from the place where the distortion had been to the open land beyond it, and for the first time, there was a weight in her expression that had not been there before, not fear, not uncertainty, but the recognition of something that had chosen not to take what it could have. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry again for a different reason, and looked at her, searching for an answer that would make sense of what had just happened, but she did not offer one. Instead, she spoke quietly, her voice steady but lower than before. "It is not finished," and the words settled into him with a clarity he could not ignore, because whatever had passed through this place, whatever had touched the wagon, the ground, the air itself, had not left, it had only moved on, and now, for reasons he did not yet understand, it had chosen to leave them standing where others had not been allowed to remain. The wind returned, but it did not feel the same. It moved across the desert like something that had just been allowed to breathe again, and Ethan stood there for a moment longer than he should have, staring at the space where the distortion had been, as if waiting for it to come back and finish what it had started. Ayana did not wait, she had already turned, already begun to walk, her steps steady, unhurried, as if the moment they had just lived through had not been an ending, but a signpost. Pointing further ahead, Ethan followed, slower at first, his mind still catching up with what his eyes had seen, or what they had not seen, and after a few steps, he spoke, his voice quieter now, shaped by something he had not felt before. "Why did it let us go?" And the question hung in the space between them, heavier than anything he had asked before. Ayana did not answer right away, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her path already chosen, and when she did speak, her words came without hesitation. "It did not let us go," she said, and that was all, leaving the rest for him to carry. Ethan frowned slightly, the meaning settling in slowly, because if that was true, then something else had happened, something he did not yet understand, and the thought followed him as they moved, step after step, back into the open stretch of desert where the land seemed unchanged, but no longer felt that way. The sun had begun its slow descent, the light softening just enough to cast longer shadows across the ground, and with it came a shift in the air, cooler now, carrying the faint scent of distance, of places not yet seen. After a while, the scattered signs of the wagon story began to appear again, not in pieces this time, but in traces, faint impressions that only showed themselves if you knew how to look. And Ayana followed them without pause, her steps guided by something deeper than sight. Ethan noticed it too, the way her path curved slightly, then straightened, the way she adjusted without stopping, and for the first time, he realized she was not just walking through the desert, she was reading it. "You knew this would happen," he said, not as an accusation, but as an attempt to understand the ground beneath him, and Ayana shook her head once. Her expression unchanged. "I knew it was possible," she replied, and there was a difference there that Ethan could not ignore. The land rose again ahead of them, not sharply, but enough to break the line of sight, and as they approached, the air shifted once more, not in stillness this time, but in tension, like a string pulled just tight enough to hum if touched. Ayana slowed, not stopping, but measuring each step more carefully now, and Ethan felt it too, that quiet pressure returning. Not as strong as before, but present, watching. They reached the crest together, and what lay beyond was not what Ethan expected, not more emptiness, not more scattered traces, but something else entirely, a narrow path cutting through the desert, worn just enough to suggest use, recent, deliberate, and leading toward a distant line of low hills that held the last of the day's light against their edges. Ayana stood still for a moment, her gaze fixed on that path, and in her silence, there was something new, not uncertainty, not hesitation, but recognition of a choice that had not been hers before this moment. Ethan looked from the path to her, waiting, not asking, because he had learned enough by now to understand that the next step would not be explained, it would be taken. She stepped forward then, onto the path, her movement quiet but final, and as her foot pressed into the worn ground, the wind shifted again, just slightly, enough to carry a sound from far ahead, faint, almost lost in the distance, but unmistakable once it reached them, the soft echo of something moving, something that did not belong to the empty desert, and Ethan felt it settle into him with a clarity he could not deny, that whatever they had just encountered had not been the end of anything, it had been a beginning, and now, for reasons he could not yet name, he was no longer just following Ayana Red Hawk across the desert, he was walking into something that had already begun to notice him. The path did not welcome them, and it did not reject them either, it simply existed, carved into the desert with a purpose that had nothing to do with comfort, and as Ayana stepped onto it, the ground beneath her feet seemed firmer, older, as if it had been walked by many who no longer left marks anywhere else. Ethan followed a step behind, his eyes scanning the edges of the trail, noticing how the sand just beyond it lay untouched, too smooth, too still, like the land itself refused to acknowledge anything that did not stay within the line. The sound they had heard earlier came again, clearer now, not loud, not close, but present, like something moving just out of sight, keeping pace without needing to be seen. "It is leading somewhere," Ethan said, though the truth of it felt incomplete even as he spoke it, and Ayana gave a slight nod, her gaze fixed ahead. "Everything does," she replied, but there was something in her tone that suggested this path did not simply lead, it chose. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground, and with it, the light softened into a deep amber that stretched across the hills ahead, making them seem closer than they were, and yet the distance did not close as quickly as it should have. Ethan felt it after a while, the strange pull of the place, the way each step forward seemed to take more from him than the last, not in strength, but in certainty, like the path was asking him to leave something behind with every foot he placed upon it. "Do you feel that?" he asked, and this time, Ayana did not answer with words, she simply slowed her pace, just enough for him to match her step for step, and in that shared rhythm, he understood that whatever this was, it was not meant to be faced alone. The hills drew nearer, their edges sharper now, and between them, a narrow opening revealed itself, a passage carved not by tools, but by time, and as they approached, the air changed. Again, cooler, heavier, carrying a stillness that did not belong to open land. Ayana stopped just short of the entrance, her eyes tracing the contours of the rock, the shadows that pooled within it, and for a moment, she did not move, as if listening for something beyond sound. Ethan stood beside her, his breath steady now, his body no longer fighting the desert, but moving with it, and though he did not understand what lay ahead, he no longer questioned why he was here. "This is where it went," he said, not asking, not doubting, and Ayana nodded once, her expression calm but focused. "Yes," she said, and then, after a brief pause that carried more weight than silence should, she added, "And where it is waiting." The word settled between them, and for a second, Ethan considered what it meant to turn back, to leave the path, to return to the open desert where things made sense again. Where the ground held its shape and the air did not watch you in return, but the thought passed as quickly as it came, because something deeper had already taken hold, something that would not let him walk away without knowing. Ayana stepped forward first, crossing the threshold into the narrow passage, her form slipping into shadow with a quiet certainty that did not ask for permission, and after a brief moment, Ethan followed, the light behind him fading as the walls closed in just enough to change the sound of his steps. Inside, the air was still, almost too still, and the faint echo of their movement seemed to linger longer than it should, as if the space itself was holding on to it. Then, from deeper within the passage, that sound came again, clearer now, closer, not a voice, not a step, but something between, something that carried intention without form, and Ethan felt it settle into him with a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt, that whatever had chosen not to take them out there in the open desert had brought them here instead. The passage narrowed as they moved deeper, the walls drawing closer in a slow, deliberate way that did not trap, but guided, and the light behind them faded into a thin ribbon that barely reached their backs anymore, leaving the air ahead dim, cool, and unnervingly still. Ethan adjusted his pace without thinking, his boots landing softer now, as if the ground demanded quiet, and each step echoed just a fraction too long, stretching the sound into something that did not belong entirely to him. Ayana walked ahead, her shoulders relaxed but her attention sharpened, her eyes not fixed on any one point, but moving across the space as if reading something written between the shadows. The sound returned again, closer now, clearer, not a footstep, not a voice, but a presence that carried intention without form, and Ethan felt it brush against his awareness like a thought that was not his own. "It brought us here," he said, his voice low, careful, and this time Ayana did not deny it. She only slowed, just slightly, enough for him to come alongside her, not behind, not following, but standing within. The same moment, the passage opened gradually, the walls easing apart into a wide chamber carved by time and silence, the ceiling high enough to let a faint shaft of light fall from above, illuminating the center of the space where the ground lay smooth, untouched, as if nothing had ever walked there and yet everything had passed through it. Ethan stopped at the edge of that open ground, something in him refusing to step forward without understanding why, and he noticed then, the absence, no scattered objects, no broken signs like before, just a single thing resting at the center, small, still, unmistakable. It was the child's shoe they had seen earlier, no longer half buried, no longer lost, but placed, carefully, as if returned. Ayana stepped closer, her gaze fixed on it, and for the first time, there was a weight in her expression that carried more than observation, something deeper, something that recognized what this meant. "This is not where they stopped," she said quietly, and Ethan felt the truth of it settle into him before he could question it. Because this place did not hold endings, it held decisions. The air shifted again, not with wind, but with presence, and that same distortion from before began to form at the far edge of the chamber, faint at first, then clearer, bending the light in a way that made the space feel uneven. Ethan did not step back this time, though every instinct told him to, because something had changed, not in the thing before them, but in himself, a quiet understanding that whatever this was, it was not there to take blindly, it was there to weigh. Ayana moved forward, slow, deliberate, stopping just short of the shoe, and she lowered her hand again to her chest, the same gesture as before, but this time, there was something more in it, something offered, not spoken, but given. The distortion pulsed, a subtle shift in the air that responded not to movement, but to intention, and Ethan realized then, with a clarity that felt both strange and certain, that this was not a force to be fought or escaped, it was something that answered to what was carried into it. He looked at the shoe, then at Ayana, then at the space where the light bent and shifted, and slowly, without thinking, he stepped forward, closing the distance by a single pace, enough to place himself within that unseen line. The air pressed in, not heavy, not painful, but present, aware, and for a brief moment, everything held, the light, the silence, the breath between them. Then, just as before, something changed, not outwardly, but inwardly, a quiet release, a loosening of something unseen, and the distortion softened, its edges fading, not disappearing, but withdrawing, as if a decision had been made. Ayana lowered her hand, her gaze steady, and Ethan felt his breath returned fully, deeper than it had been since they entered the passage. Neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to explain, only something to understand, and as the light settled back into its natural shape, the chamber felt different, not empty, but complete in a way that had not been there before, as if whatever had passed through this place had not taken something away, but had left something behind instead. The chamber settled into silence, but it was not the same silence they had entered with. It no longer felt like something waiting to take, it felt like something that had already decided to leave them untouched, and in that quiet, Ethan Cole stood still, his eyes fixed on the small shoe. Resting in the center, no longer just an object, but a message left behind in a language he had only just begun to understand. Ayanna stepped forward first, closing the final distance, and this time, when she reached for the shoe, her movement carried no hesitation, only care. Lifting it gently from the ground as if returning it to the story it belonged to, she turned it slightly in her hand, her gaze softening just enough to reveal something deeper than before, not sorrow, not relief, but recognition. And when she looked back at Ethan, there was no question in her eyes, only a quiet knowing that the path they had walked had reached its end. They were not taken, she said, her voice low, steady, and the words settled into the space with a clarity that reshaped everything that had come before. Because what had seemed like disappearance was not loss, but something else entirely. Ethan stepped closer, his gaze shifting from the shoe to her, searching for the meaning behind her words, and for the first time since the desert had nearly claimed him, he felt something loosen inside his chest, something that had been held too tight for too long. Then where did they go? He asked, not out of fear, but out of the need to understand the shape of the world he had stepped into. Ayanna did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned her eyes toward the opening above, where the last of the evening light filtered down into the chamber, soft and golden, and in that light, the air no longer bent, no longer shifted, it simply existed, calm and still. They were allowed to continue, she said finally, and there was no mystery in her tone, only truth, simple and complete. Ethan let out a slow breath, the weight of it leaving him in a way he did not expect, because for the first time, he understood that what they had